Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Iain Johnston. I'm the regional head for Integrity Risk International based in Hong Kong. Tonight we're going to, this morning for the guys in the US, etc., we're going to run through navigating political risk to business operations and supply chains in China. During the course of this 1 hour panel, this session, we've got a panel of internationally recognized SMEs who will discuss the topic of navigating the business operations. The attendees we have so far range from private equity, fashion and retail, banking, insurance, academia, government, technology and communications, real estate, and we have some legal practitioners as well. Each panelist will speak for approximately 10 minutes. And at the end of all the presentations, we will hold a Q&A session. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or you can use the chat function in order to send me your questions. First of the speakers we have tonight is Martin Purbrick. Martin is the owner of Purbrick and Associates, a risk advisory firm specializing in business intelligence, due diligence, corporate integrity management, and investigations with a strong focus on China. Martin lived in Hong Kong for more than 30 years and has relocated back to Scotland and has held a number of senior leadership roles with the Hong Kong Jockey Club, McKenzie, Intel, and the Royal Hong Kong Police Force. He has a Master's of Arts in Politics and Modern History from the University of Edinburgh and a Master of Letters in Terrorism Studies from the University of St Andrews. He writes regularly on the subject of China in the Asian Affairs Journal and Mingpao newspaper group. Martin, without further ado, over to you.
Hi, good evening to you, Iain, and good morning to everyone else, wherever you may be. Thank you very much for this chance to talk to everyone today, and also to talk first, because I think that means I can give a little bit of a broad introduction, and then some more detailed analysis would come from Mimi and Mike. So what I'd like to talk about first is what's the situation, what are the longer term changes, specifically with regard to China, which is where I think we're all most interested. So I'd suggest the outlook of the PRC government clearly has changed in the last several years, definitely under the leadership of Xi Jinping. It's most visibly changed in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, obviously, because of protests in Hong Kong and a quite a harsh crackdown in Xinjiang. But what I'd also suggest is if an international company has been doing business in mainland China in the past and has navigated the risks of doing business there, then I think the changes in Hong Kong and Xinjiang don't fundamentally affect that risk of doing business in China. And clearly the changing environment does affect compliance with US sanctions. There are new US sanctions on Hong Kong and Xinjiang, on people and entities. But the risk profile for Hong Kong and Xinjiang is quite specific and rather different from the broader risk profile in the mainland, I think. So I think if we were to sum up what's changed in regard to China and Hong Kong generally, I think the difference between mainland China and Hong Kong in the past was that the red lines of the authorities in mainland China were never clear anyway. But international companies have been quite mindful about how to operate in that sort of system and structure of moving boundaries. And if you do business in China for many years, you get used to that and you set your risk parameters accordingly. I think Hong Kong was in the past very different, as in Hong Kong there were clear boundaries based on laws and regulations, and hence the operating environment in Hong Kong was always much clearer to international companies. And I think that's the difference now. There's a perception that there's a more arbitrary implementation and interpretation of certain laws and regulations by the Hong Kong government. And whilst that's mostly focused on political issues, I think they'd be concerned about when that affects business and how it affects business, particularly who you do business with. So I think my underlying view is that business risk and compliance management in Hong Kong by Western international companies should now be treated on the same level as in mainland China. So the policies and procedures for risk and compliance that companies have had in the mainland, they should also start to not replicate, but to align in Hong Kong, in particular in relation to interaction with the authorities. So just to dwell on Hong Kong a little bit, why has this been happening? in Hong Kong. And I think it's clear that the PRC government was most concerned that protests in Hong Kong did not spill over into mainland China. I think that was their underlying concern. If it was contained in Hong Kong, it was quite manageable. Just to illustrate this with one anecdote, in 2009, my colleagues and I in my last job were told by Public Security Bureau officers in Guangdong that, or that rather they asked us if our company is better managed and better manages our employees than does Cathay Pacific, which they told us failed to stop their staff from protesting against the government. And I think this illustrates what the authorities in China believe. Western companies can do business in China, but there must be no involvement or comment about the Chinese Communist Party, the Central People's Government, or politics at all in the country. And there was a risk of spillover from Hong Kong, which the authorities felt was real. Xinjiang is obviously quite different from Hong Kong. The repression in Xinjiang is, I suggest, aimed at eradicating any dissent and suppressing Uyghur Islamic culture so that the population there knows that Han Chinese rule is the only way of life possible for them. And that clearly is incredibly harsh. It's been described as one of the most serious humanitarian crises of this century so far, the 21st century. But as I go on with this introduction, I think the thing to bear in mind is this overall approach from the PRC government to how they govern their country is not new. It's definitely more visible at the moment because of the extent of the protests in Hong Kong, the subsequent suppression, and the absolute brutality of the suppression in Xinjiang. But how the Central People's Government governs China is not new. We've known for a long time it's a Leninist government in how they implement policy. They still adhere to some sort of Marxist doctrine, especially so under the Xi administration. So I think we should bear that in mind when we look at the current situation. But what I'd just like to outline a little bit is 3 key points, I think, regarding long-term changes and why they're more long-term and less short-term. So firstly, I think the governing system in Hong Kong has actually been changing for some time, certainly since the early 2000s. Secondly, US policy towards China has also been changing for some years with the influence of certain people in the US government, certain think tanks who believe that continuing deep economic engagement with China is not in the best interests of the USA. So I think the thing I point out there is it's not Trump. It's other influences within the US government and well, what Trump would call the deep state perhaps in the US. And thirdly, I think supply chains and manufacturing in China have been diversifying away from coastal provinces to inward regions, as well as other parts of Asia, especially Southeast Asia, in the past decade due to rising costs. So again, this move, this decoupling from China that's been talked about in some political circles is not necessarily new. Economic decoupling may just reflect some of the changes that have been taking place already. So if I could just say a little bit more about the first point, the Hong Kong governing system. If you think back to 2003, there were massive protests against what was then the proposed introduction of the national security legislation. Reportedly, around 1 million people protesting, and the government of Deng Qiuhua withdrawing that legislation. And from that point, it became clear that the Central People's Government was playing a stronger role in the local Hong Kong administration. And actually that was stated quite openly by some members of the Communist Party. In an article in 2008, Chao Bao, who leads the research department of the CCP in Hong Kong, explained that there are 2 governing teams in Hong Kong. The first governing team is the local Hong Kong administration, and the second team is the Central People's Government group that is responsible for Hong Kong affairs. So that's been openly stated by the PRC authorities for 20 years. So I think for analysts, it shouldn't be anything new that they've been taking a stronger and stronger role in the direct government in Hong Kong, although it's accelerated in the past 2 years, clearly. And we see that through the Hong Kong Macau Affairs Office, the Liaison Office. It's far more visible now in how it interacts with local government. And those are not hidden agencies. There are multiple central government agencies in Hong Kong that have a strong role in engaging with local government and engaging with the local community. As I mentioned, the Hong Kong Macau Affairs Office, the Liaison Office, which is a subset of that, the PRC Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Xinhua, the New China News Agency, which is a key United Front organization, and of course the People's Liberation Army Garrison. They're all quite tangible entities that are based there, have thousands of people based there as well, and interact with local government and interact with the local community. And that's been going on for quite some time. So I think it's questionable how other agencies might become involved in Hong Kong affairs. Clearly the PLA and the People's Armed Police seemed to threaten that they would take some action during the height of the protests last year. And I think that risk was quite real. If the local authorities could not get control of the situation, I think there was always a risk that the People's Armed Police, or worse, the PLA could take action themselves. I don't think those threats from them were meaningless. So again, to put it in perspective, I think the changes in Hong Kong that we think we see now are nothing new. They've been going on for 2 decades, and they're part of a gradual creeping centralization of government from the PRC over Hong Kong, as it does throughout the rest of the People's Republic of China. So the second point, US policy towards China. As I said, I think this has been changing for some years, and it's not just the Trump administration. The Trump administration has reflected or articulated those changes, certainly from US Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, who said in July this year that the key issues regarding US concerns with China are economic espionage by China, the related theft of intellectual property and trade secrets, the repression in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, Chinese propaganda in the US and elsewhere, especially United Front efforts, and military expansion in the South China Sea. So they're quite a tangible set of concerns that have been articulated by Pompeo and Trump, but actually have been growing concerns for quite some time. I think one of the people who's voiced those concerns has been at the center of US administration for many years, is Michael Pillsbury, who's written an excellent book about the subject. And he's stated in his book, and I quote, "Trade and technology were supposed to lead to a convergence of Chinese and Western views of regional and global order. It hasn't," unquote. So Pillsbury has been saying for some time that China's actions contradict any peaceful or productive intentions. And he's been recommending for some time that US policies and strategies change to compete with China and to reflect that there is competition. And I think there's a very interesting State Department report released yesterday called the Challenge of China, which I would recommend everyone read from the State Department website to understand evolving US policy. So I think as well as those competitive issues, there are security issues. And then that's about the balance of power in Asia, which the PRC is clearly trying to change, especially with the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, which isn't just an issue on maps. It really is a major defense issue for the US because of the long-term use of the first island chain in the South China Sea, stretching down from the Kuril Islands, Japan and its archipelago, Taiwan, the Philippines and Borneo, which really projects this US defense in depth across the Pacific Ocean. So breaking that first island chain with the reversion of sovereignty in Taiwan to the People's Republic would really dent US defense in depth, I think. So it's a security issue in itself. Other issues like Hong Kong and Xinjiang, I think are more moral issues for the US. They're not really core security issues, but the fact that the US government comments on them means that they have leverage in negotiations, but they're moral and not core security issues. So Iain, if I haven't got over time, just very quickly on the last point about supply chains, manufacturing in China and this diversification, I'd just like to give a quote from the Financial Times, an article several weeks ago. I quote, "According to surveys conducted by the American Chamber of Commerce in China over the past 2 years, about 40% of US companies in China have moved manufacturing facilities out of the country already or are considering doing so. Taiwanese companies, among the earliest and largest investors in China, began to adjust their manufacturing setup as early as 15 years ago. when labour started becoming scarce in the coastal regions where most foreign investment is concentrated. Footwear, accessories, toy and furniture manufacturers began moving to countries in Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam and Cambodia, more than a decade ago. And I think this is important because the discussion about economic decoupling now, I think is not a new emphasis on the relationship. It's a result and a reaction to the changing economic boundaries of those relationships, economic relationships in the PRC. And I can say that from my last job, having spent the last 10 years building a very large racecourse in southern China, which I would not recommend for anyone's mental health. The labor costs in Guangdong itself rise by about 10% per year. And a lot of that is statutory and mandatory, and you really can't escape it. And that has an impact on business. So this move away from the South is quite long term. And decoupling, I think, is a reaction to that. Iain, I hope I stayed just about within time, but over to you.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Okay, our next presenter is Michael Shaw, Senior Executive Advisor to Integrity Risk International and a successful entrepreneur who specializes in risk data, compliance and background screening. He has over 30 years in international business and governmental experience, primarily in China, India and the Asia Pacific region. Michael co-founded, financed, built and managed 3 of Asia's most successful risk and data background screening businesses, Quest Research, IntegriScreen and Dataflow. Michael remains focused on business in the global risk management and risk data spaces and provides business consultancy regarding risk, anti-bribery and corruption compliance, corporate and business development. He is also a subject matter expert on international enhanced due diligence and the design of screening programs. Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, Iain. Good morning and good evening to everybody. Thank you, Martin. Very in-depth and interesting overview of what the political tensions are. In terms of business and how we do business in primarily China, what do these tensions actually mean? What do they translate into? On the political side, I think that the biggest risk is inadvertently being caught up in something that you're not really part of, or you're just part of a bigger issue at play. A common chapter here that we've seen recently is, for example, captive diplomacy. Now, this sounds a bit far-fetched, yeah, it probably won't happen to you, but if it does, it's a bit of a disaster. And we've seen this here in Canada recently, with the arrest of 2 Canadian businessmen who are very active in China, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Now, they were arrested on generally accepted trumped-up charges in the wake of Meng Wanzhou's arrest in Vancouver. Now, Meng is the CFO of Huawei. She's been arrested and is awaiting extradition to the US. She's fighting it. So Canada's been brought into this as part of a treaty obligation to the US, and as a result of that, the Canadians would say these 2 Canadian businessmen have been arrested and detained in China without trial so far. They are going to be charged with trying, I believe, with spying, I believe, and one can only presume that they're going to be charged with accessing state secrets. Now, state secrets have always been a cause of concern for foreigners operating in China. It's a very wide area. They're generally thought of as being matters relating to the security of the nation, which are only available to a select audience for a select amount of time. So pretty wide definition. And this definition's made worse, I think, by the fact that the onus and the burden of state secrets and keeping a state secret is put very much onto the publisher or the sharer, who has to get express permission from a mainland governmental authority prior to the release. So it follows then that any matter which is focused on the PRC's economy, government, military, technology, could really be construed as a state secret if the release of that has not been expressly authorised by by a Chinese governmental figure. As you can imagine, it would be relatively easy to ensnare an individual in such a charge should the political will and the expediency for such exist. It's not just Canadians that have been caught up in this. The potential is a lot wider, I think. The Wall Street Journal, for example, reported in October this year that multiple channels in China were reporting to them and warning the US that China may decide to arrest Americans to respond to the ongoing arrests and prosecutions of Chinese scientists in the US who had allegedly hidden their links to the PLA when they were applying for student and work visas. So, it is a risk. It's, as I said, it's one of those things that will probably never happen to you. But if it does, it is a disaster. So, how do you ameliorate these risks? Well, I think as a Western company, as an American company operating in China, you really should focus on how your decisions are taken, or how your statements made by your company may be seen by PRC authorities. And I think increasingly that risk is now not only coming from PRC authorities, it's how your decisions and how your statements and how you act as a Western company is interpreted by these mainland-based social media warriors, these sort of 50-cent group of people who agitate in a very nationalistic way for the government to take action, and are often instigated and wound up by the government to do this. What this means is that seemingly uncontentious issues may be capable of provoking drastic action from governmental figures, or it could be consumer-led activity, like protests and boycotts of your goods. So it ranges from governmental to sort of consumer type of action. This kind of action isn't just restricted to foreigners. We've seen recently that the PRC regulatory apparatus have moved against the massive Ant financial listing in Hong Kong and Shanghai. This listing was due to take place on the 5th of November. Now, presumably, Ant Financial's listing was in line with current regulations as they were at the time. I mean, you don't often launch an IPO without having the regulatory side of it completely squared away. Also, the government social security fund was one of the largest investors in the IPO. So you would have thought that the Ant Financial IPO would have been blessed at the highest levels. However, the listing was pulled at the last minute. Listing regulations were changed at the last minute. They changed in a way that made the Ant listing untenable at that time. Everyone's saying, well, yes, Ant Financial will ultimately list again, and I'm sure it will, but it didn't list when it was meant to, and a clear message has been sent. So why did this happen? Well, one school of thought is that Jack Ma, who is the head of Alibaba, which was the largest shareholder in Ant Financial, had upset the Chinese regulators in a speech he gave in Shanghai in October. Now, at this speech, which was attended by the regulatory community in China, Jack Ma gave this speech, which likened Chinese lenders to pawnbrokers. Well, you can say these kind of things in a normal business environment. Unfortunately, he said that it reportedly wasn't taken so well, and to add sort of insult to injury, he spoke immediately after Wang Qishan, who is the Chinese vice president, and this reportedly caused him some kind of embarrassment. So, if the goalposts can shift on Jack Ma, this guy is one of the PRC's richest, most influential, best-known business leaders, previously a darling of the Communist Party, entrusted with being able to spread the message to the wider world, then unfortunately they can shift on anybody. So I think it's always a good idea for Western, international, US companies to have a plan in place should an ill wind blow in your direction from from this political risk issue. At the very least, you should know where your senior international management are. Where in China are they? Are they in China? Are they on a business trip? Are they living there? Are they living abroad? If you see an issue which is seemingly innocuous about to blow up, can you get them to leave China? Where are the families? Where's your IP? Does it need to be in China? Have you got secure communications outside of PRC-based servers? What does your business continuity plan look like? When was the last time it was updated? And I think, most importantly, how do you explain your actions and the situation you're in to your mainland staff and also to your mainland clients? So there's a lot of things that you have to sort of bear in mind, I think, for this issue. I mean, as Martin said, prior to July this year, these risks were very much contained to mainland China, but we are now seeing very specific risks regarding Hong Kong being posed by the Hong Kong national security legislation. That legislation, as Martin explained, is ultimately overseen by the Ministry of State Security, and it does operate in parallel. Is it higher up the chain or lower down the chain than the Hong Kong norms of common law and the independence of the judiciary? I suspect so, but it hasn't been tested yet. And in China, issues of national security will always trump all other considerations. Wording of regulations is often very vague, but the punishments are very well defined. Recent example of this is MOFCOM's Unreliable Foreign Entity List, which was promulgated in September this year. This is a list which is being put together of unreliable foreign entities, and for that, just read into the fact that it's designed to stop foreign entities taking part in international sanctions against Chinese companies. So, in this piece of legislation, in this list, it cites acts such as endangering Chinese national security and developmental interests by suspending normal business transactions. So that sounds very much to me like someone taking part in sanctions, not withdrawing from services from the Chinese market, being punished. These are now punished by restriction of business licenses, refusal of entry to staff into China, cancellation of staff working visas, and I think the catch-all other necessary measures. What does that mean? We don't know, and we won't know until it actually happens. Again, going back to the fact that the punishments are very well defined, they're very well, they're designed to catch all, but the actual wording of the legislation is left very vague. So I think the key issue here is, what would endangering the developmental interests of China look like? Would it mean ending a banking relationship with a Chinese client in respect of international sanctions? Would it mean, would it also apply to short sellers, for example, who write a piece of research which is critical of a Chinese company engaged in a strategic business in China? We just don't know, and no one really knows until it happens. I think the one thing that we do know is that times are changing, and you have to be totally across them, and you have to be cognizant of the risks involved. So, given the shifting sands and the political relationship between China and the US, given the increasing political risks, given the fact that we're now stuck in the middle of the COVID pandemic, is it time to reconsider diversifying supply chains and the options that they present away from China? Well, I think this throws up some interesting questions. First one, of course, is where would you relocate to if you decided that you wanted to leave the Chinese market? Who would you choose as your new suppliers, for example? Third-party screening is now more important than ever, and you have to ensure, obviously, that your new partner isn't going to embarrass you by being an inappropriate partner or being someone that you can't do business with or throw up other regulatory issues. Where would you place your new facilities? There's a whole host of governmental considerations such as land grants, land purchases, land use permits. Dealing with local governments can be painful. Also, dealing with construction contractors and local partners, they all provide a compliance headache for you, one that you've already got under control and are managing in China. So would you consider staying in China and just adopting enhanced risk management procedures? Well, maybe. It's a tough decision. I mean, what we're seeing in the market is that, yes, there is a definite sentiment away from China, but it's not uniform. It won't happen overnight. And despite all of the political risk implications and the COVID implications, that at the moment really isn't the main driver. The main driver is commercial considerations. I mean, China is a manufacturer of key components and has strong networks of vertically integrated suppliers. That's already in place. It takes time to get that kind of structure and infrastructure in place. It's just not an assembly center anymore. It's increasingly high value, increasingly high cost. Chinese companies, for example, are not just producing for Western clients. The Chinese market is now being increasingly catered for by subcontractors and actors in the supply chain. Foreign multinationals won't really want to be seen as leaving the China market entirely. I remember going back to what we were talking about a few moments ago in terms of how are your decisions taken by the Chinese market. It may be difficult to be leaving the Chinese market for subcontracting and not get any political blowback from that. So to an extent, a move away from China is already underway, and it is driven by the search for low-cost environments. So where are people going? Well, Apple's moving into Vietnam, for example, in a big way. They're taking all of their big partners with them: Foxconn, Pegatron, Inventic. Pegatron has just invested $1 billion US in a plant in Hai Phong in northern Vietnam, and now half of all Samsung's smartphones are produced in Vietnam. So obviously, Vietnam is a big market, an emerging market for supply chains. But why Vietnam? Well, it's close to China, obviously, so it's near to existing supply chains. It's got a high growth of GDP, highly educated workforce. It's investor friendly. I think they've got something like 13 or 14 international trade agreements with international trade bodies, not just by national ones. And obviously, its costs are far less than China. So this trend is already in motion. It's already happening, but maybe not for the reasons that we immediately think. So I'll end my time by saying that despite the rising geopolitical issues with China and the headache of supply chain relocation, I still think the number one risk facing businesses in China, it isn't the political risk, it isn't the supply chain risk, it's the risk of overseas corruption. So be it launched by the SEC or the DOJ in the US, or the UK authorities under the UK Bribery Act, overseas corruption cases are becoming more numerous than ever. And they really highlight the need to know who you're doing business with, because that really is the primary defense against certain aspects of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Knowing your client in an Asian context, well, what does that really mean? It means you've really got to have a system, you've got to have a program to manage your third parties. You've got to be able to demonstrate to regulators, but you do know who your partners are. You do know if there's any political exposure there. You do know that they haven't just been established to set up a fraudulent system. And you need to really monitor the ongoing risk and conduct of all your active vendors. You should really look at a risk-based approach in the compliance process, so that you're looking to do dynamic risk assessments, predictive risk assessments. And above all, I think your program that you have must be consistent, comprehensive, auditable, and defensible, because ultimately that's what a regulator would want to see. It's necessary to constantly monitor any program you have. You should be monitoring it to ensure that it's still fit for purpose, but it fits with the current regulatory guidance to ensure that your program is still up to date, and you need to constantly monitor the third parties in your program to ensure that they're still appropriate business partners to do business with. You should also, I think, constantly communicate with your business partners and tell them, reiterate to them what your expectations are in terms of the avoidance of foreign corruption and what are your anti-bribery expectations. You should also be helping to train them and get them up to speed with trying to raise the bar for them. I think lastly,
Mike, we probably want to bring in Minnie at this point.
Okay, just one further point. Lastly, don't forget that foreign corruption is illegal everywhere. But it's not just a foreign thing, it is illegal. So we cannot discount local anti-corruption investigations in China. They may be politically motivated, and being caught in the middle of that is always unadvisable, uncomfortable, and to say the least, highly disruptive. With that, I'll leave it and hand it back to Iain. Thank you very much.
Okay, our final presenter tonight is Minnie. She's talking at 1 o'clock in the morning from Sydney. Okay, Minnie is the head of Baker McKenzie's APAC Compliance and Investigations Group after successfully completing 4 years as a global head. Minnie's work engagements focus on a variety of ESG risks, including sanctions, anti-bribery and corruption, human rights violations in the supply chains, and significant financial misconduct. Her experience covers investigations and risk management and mitigation in China, India, and many other parts of Asia and across a variety of industries. Minnie has more than 30 years experience and is a trusted advisor to the boards and audit committees of Baker McKenzie's most significant global clients, assisting them to establish and enhance their risk management programs and credibly investigate transgressions to support a strong commitment to the culture of compliance. 2019, Minnie was awarded the Woman Lawyer of the Year at the Macallan ALB Hong Kong Law Awards and Best in White Collar Crime Euro Money Asia Women in Business Law Awards. Over to you, Minnie. I'm glad you're still awake.
Thanks, Iain. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, and it's been really interesting listening to Martin and Michael. Iain is quite right. I am currently, as of this week, sitting in Sydney in an isolation hotel waiting to be let out, but normally I'm in Hong Kong. So, it's interesting when Martin, of course, prior to your current life in Scotland, was in Hong Kong, and Michael, you're in Canada. So Iain and I are genuinely the people that are in the hot seat more of the time. So perhaps that gives us a slightly different perspective, and that's the perspective that I want to share with you today. I want to just share my screen, if I may, because I think it's interesting to, let me just see if I can move this around. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting to see it, to effectively be living through this amazingly fascinating period of history. And it is challenging, and being there throughout this period. I've been in Hong Kong now 6.5 years, and when I started, when I landed, my first day was the 1st of July 2014, and if you will all remember, that was the start of the Yellow Umbrella protest movement. So it's almost as if it's a journey that I've been on from quite some time ago. But the more recent events are interesting, and Martin has mentioned parts of it. Michael's also mentioned parts of it, and it isn't by any means a simple journey. it has come with it a number of things that have disrupted from within and from without. You know, I'm a compliance and investigations lawyer, so what I deal with is risk. So the risks that we have been dealing with up to this point in Asia have largely been focused around anti-bribery and corruption, you know, human rights issues, serious, you know, senior executive misconduct, white-collar crime, that sort of thing. These are different types of risks that we're grappling with at the moment, because what it is it's a risks based on cultural, political, and legal. And that's a very powerful combination. So I just wanted to sort of share with you this timeline, because I do think it sort of focuses everything on the way things transpired. I'm not going to go through all of the elements on the timeline, but as you can see from, you know, if we look at the 30th of June, which is the introduction of the national security law in China, and we move on to the Hong Kong Autonomy Act that was passed by President Trump's administration, the various executive orders that the administration has enacted. We have probably had more sanctions coming out of executive orders than in this short period of time than we've had over many years. And they are strange and wonderful things, because the guidance is not catching up with these orders that President Trump is enacting. It certainly hasn't stopped him in recent weeks. The fact that he has lost the election, perhaps he doesn't appreciate that, but the fact is more executive orders have been announced and applied. And so we're still dealing with these issues. And, you know, there is an old saying, which is, you know, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. So it's interesting for us who are living on the ground in terms of Hong Kong as to what this is going to mean. What does it mean to Hong Kong? What does it mean to its relationship with the US? What does it mean to its place within China? And these are all sort of questions that we're looking at the moment. So I want to just take you through the national security law in just a little bit more detail, because I think it's important to understand what its purpose was and how it has been implemented. I remember when I first started speaking about the NSL, it was right at the beginning when we just didn't have very much insight as to the way that it was going to be implemented and the way that it was going to be enforced. We have a little bit more insight now, but look, time is going to tell. But as you can see, there are four main areas that the national security is designed to cover, being succession, subversion, terrorist activities, and collusion with a foreign country or external elements to endanger national security. They're very broadly drafted. You would appreciate that the law itself is in its original form in the Chinese language, which is unusual for us in Hong Kong because most of our laws are all in English from the common law system. So this is the first Chinese law. Following the introduction of the law, we also had the introduction of the implementation rules under Article 43 of the NSL. And this was actually provided in English. And I want to take you through that very quickly in a short moment. As you can see, the penalties are significant in terms of life imprisonment for natural persons and fines, confiscation of proceeds, and suspension of business operation or revocation of license for companies. The it does have a extraterritorial effect. The law is about any acts against Hong Kong. So it can apply to offences committed outside of Hong Kong by a Hong Kong person or a Hong Kong established company. And it can even apply to offences committed by a person who's not a Hong Kong person, but has committed such an act against Hong Kong. It isn't retrospective, so we're now living the enforcement of the law in relation to acts that have taken place after 30th of June. There is a supervision of the way that the Act is enforced, and that is by the PRC. And it does have, as Martin alluded to, it does have the ability to effectively trump all other laws that may be inconsistent with the national security law. There is a provision for certain matters that are endangering national security or involving government, foreign governments, to be prosecuted and heard in China. And there are some broad and sort of some wider powers than we have seen in Hong Kong before. These are the implementation rules and the powers that authorities have in relation to conducting investigations in order to collect evidence to enforce the NSL. And there is an ability to have a warrantless search, which already had existed before the national security law, but it is now a more broadly applied situations that could come under the scenario where police may attend to conduct a dawn raid and a search of premises under the NSL without having first obtained a warrant. So there are some broader powers. There are some powers that are very similar to what we had already experienced. It hasn't quite taken over in terms of the number of cases that have come out of the national security law. They have actually been much lower in number. They have focused very heavily on those that were very visible in the protest movement and those that were supportive of the protest movement, including media outlets such as Apple Daily. So it has, however, had the desired effect that was intended, and that is to quell the protests in Hong Kong. The protests had an enormous impact on Hong Kong in a number of ways. Since the introduction of the national security law and since the arrest of many that have been involved in the pro-democracy movement, the protests are all but over. We see very little of any protest activities. There is a clear messaging in Hong Kong about the national security law, and it really has had the effect of putting Hong Kong back into business. And in fact, business has come through with COVID numbers being relatively low as well. And that has encouraged business to go back. The listing, the listed company, the share price of Hong Kong has increased. Retail sector, without the benefit of tourism, has actually still managed to see an uptick. It has had the effect that was intended. Now that I don't make political statements about that, but I do say that in terms of the ability for Hong Kong people to get back to business, it certainly has assisted in relation to that. However, we then have the continuation of the US input into Hong Kong. And, you know, again, I'm not making any kind of political comment, but the impact, the continuing impact of the executive orders and sanctions and resulting sanctions have in fact created a different type of disruption. And that is something that we're finding our clients, particularly in the finance sector, finance, investment, insurance, these are all sectors that are grappling with what should they do, what should they not do in light of the prevalence of sanctions that have been enacted. And it affects US companies, of course, because sanctions apply to US entities and persons primarily. But it also affects non-US persons that are caught in relation to sanctions that apply to US dollar transactions. So the effect of the sanctions has almost taken over in terms of the disruption of the protests. On 9th of November, we've got an additional 5 individuals that were added to the list of 11 in terms of the LegCo members that were sanctioned by the US because of their role in enacting the national security law and the suppression of democracy movement in Hong Kong. The most recent development we've seen is the executive order which prohibits investments in communist Chinese military companies. At least that's the title of this particular executive order. Now, this executive order was enacted on the 12th of November, and it applies to effectively 31 listed entities. Now, these entities had been previously listed or designated. They weren't designated as SDNs. However, they had been listed with no specific consequence on them and no prohibition on parties from dealing with them. So, however, the executive order now takes these 31 entities, which include Huawei and Hikvision, and has made an order that all US persons must divest themselves of any securities that they have in these listed entities. There are some deadlines provided. The actual executive order takes effect on the 11th of January, and that is 60 days after it's issued. From our close consideration of what President Trump is likely to do, we understand that more entities may be added to this list of 31. It is a very complicated situation in terms of divesting from the securities that may be held in these entities, because these are entities that are parts of investment portfolios. They're part of bond investments. They're part of pension fund investments. There is a wind down period until 11th of November 2021. And there is, of course, the hope that the new Biden administration may choose to wind back this executive order. However, that's not a guarantee in any sense, because the relationship between the US and China is at a very poor level, and the President-elect Biden will definitely need to engage in some very serious and senior level discussions with the Chinese government during which time I suspect no executive order will be withdrawn or undone. And therefore, this issue that particularly the finance industry is grappling with is going to continue for some time. And unfortunately, that disruption is going to be far-reaching and will result in a lot of costs, a lot of time, a lot of resources, and a lot of risk to both US companies and US persons who will need to work out how they extract themselves, divest themselves from these particular securities. So I don't think, this is definitely not one of those stories where I have a happy ending. It is a story that is, however, needs close monitoring, close understanding. In relation to this executive order, we are all waiting for some guidance from OFAC in terms of some rules around or licenses around certain types of investments that may be excluded or protected from this executive order. But until such time, this is what we're dealing with. If there are more entities added to the list, then that will, in any event, create additional complications for business in Hong Kong. Last point I wanted to make is in relation to the unreliable entity list that Michael mentioned. It is interesting because the unreliable entity list actually has been around since 2019, but it really hasn't been utilised or companies added to it. There have been a number of companies that have been threatened to be added. It is actually a list designed not simply to be a punishment for companies that speak out against the security of China. It is also designed to actually put companies on the list if they just don't function or they fail in terms of the business that they conduct. So it's, I think that the origination of the unreliable entities list and perhaps what it may be used for in the future could be a little different. So it certainly wasn't introduced as a political tool, but of course anything, as we can see with executive orders, anything can be used as a political tool if you put your mind to it. So on that note, Iain, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Minnie. We have a question which is related to Article 29, related to state secrets. And what's the coverage for organisations operating in Hong Kong? How does it affect them?
So they're talking about Article 29.4. So Article 29.4 created a lot of debate, particularly amongst lawyers. Because what that Article 29.4 could suggest is that if you comply with a US sanction, then specifically in the sanctions we've been talking about, then that could be a breach of Article 29.4 of the National Security Law. Now, the Chinese Mandarin words and the English translation have some key differences. So we have watched that very closely. In our view, the Mandarin words suggest that could be the case. So in other words, the words on their reading, plain reading in Mandarin, say that if you comply with a sanction, that could be a breach of the NSL. However, and this comes back to the unreliable entities list and the NSL. The Hong Kong government and the PRC government have been very quick to talk about how they do not want to impact business. They have made it very clear that they want to protect the business in Hong Kong. As a result, they had dialogue with a number of the international chambers of commerce, and the chambers actually all sent in sort of requests, questions for clarification. 29.4 was a key part of that request for clarification. Now, we haven't received complete clarity, but we've received enough information out of the government through either discussions that the regulators have held or from this clarification memo that came out of the government, that they do not intend to use 29.4 in that manner. They say that it is to be interpreted as if you seek a sanction from a foreign power, so you're encouraging a foreign power to issue sanctions against Hong Kong, then that could be a breach of 29.4. The mere compliance with sanctions will, however, not. And we certainly have not seen any enforcement of 29.4 in the way that people were afraid of. And as you know, there have been so many sanctions and companies are complying with them. So it appears to be that the government is very is being true to that interpretation.
I realise I was on mute, but thank you very much. Okay, we've actually run out of time. So I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for the very interesting question that came through. And anyone that needs any assistance from Integrity Risk or from or has any further questions for us, please forward it to us. You can send it to me via my email. But otherwise, thank you very much for everyone for participating. And we hope that this has been useful. Thank you, Minnie, and you can go to bed.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.